Welcome to another episode, everyone. And this is the untold story of Larry Hoover and his gangster disciple empire. Let's get right into it.
Have you ever wondered who controls the streets and what it takes to rise to the top of an underground empire? Let's delve into the life of Larry Hoover, a figure whose name echoes through the streets of Chicago. A man who embodies both the fears and hopes of a community who navigated a complex web of power, violence, and survival. Born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1950, Larry Hoover's early years were far removed from the bustling, dangerous streets that would later define his legacy. His family moved to Chicago when he was just 4 years old, seeking opportunities in a city that promised more than the Deep South's entrenched racial inequalities. But Chicago in the 1950s was no safe haven. The family faced poverty, and the streets offered little solace for a young boy growing up in an area ravaged by segregation, limited opportunities, and the early stirrings of gang culture. Chicago's South Side, where Hoover would eventually come of age, was notorious for its harsh conditions. The urban decay, lack of economic resources, and police brutality set the stage for Hoover's involvement in the underworld. But it wasn't just the allure of crime that drove Larry Hoover, it was a sense of belonging. In an environment where so many were marginalized, Hoover found his community in the streets. By the time he was 13, he had joined a gang known as the Supreme Gangsters, a move that would shape his destiny in profound ways. If you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. The formation of the Gangster Disciples. Power in unity. In the rough neighborhoods of Chicago, gang culture wasn't just about violence. It was a way to survive, to claim a piece of a world that often left young black men with few options. Larry Hoover quickly rose through the ranks of the Supreme Gangsters, demonstrating leadership, strategy, and a fierce desire to control his destiny. His early crew was involved in muggings, robberies, and street-level violence. But Hoover's vision was broader than that. He didn't just want power, he wanted to reshape the world around him. By the late...
So he was a very powerful man from the beginning, was Larry Hoover. He had a vision and a strategy. Many people say he's responsible for a lot of murders and other illicit activities that damage the community. He's a hero to many, and clearly had a very and has a very brilliant mind, even though he ended up getting caught up on wiretaps in prison when he was trying to get out. That wasn't very smart.
In the 1960s, Hoover had reached a turning point. Recognizing that the street gangs were fragmented and constantly at war with each other, he saw an opportunity in unity. Alongside David Barksdale, a rival leader of the Black Disciples, Hoover brokered a ceasefire. Together, they formed the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, BGDN, merging their forces and ambitions. The new gang wasn't just a loose collection of criminals. It was an organized, militarized force that would dominate Chicago's streets for decades. This alliance wasn't just about survival or profits, it was also about protection. The members of the BGDN, largely made up of young African-American men, saw themselves as protectors of their communities, providing an alternative to the systemic violence and oppression that the police and society at large inflicted on them. But as the BGDN grew, so did the scope of its operations.
And that was the purpose of many gangs, even the gangs in Los Angeles, Crips and Bloods, was to protect the community. Since the gang's inception, that was its credo. Things have changed.
What started as a street-level organization soon expanded into drug trafficking, extortion, and other organized criminal activities. The evolution of the Gangster Disciple Nation. As the 1970s rolled in, Chicago's gang landscape was changing, and Larry Hoover was at the center of it all. After the tragic death of David Barksdale in 1974 due to kidney failure, Hoover assumed full control of the gang. Under his leadership, the Black Gangster disciple nation began to fracture. Internal divisions, power struggles, and law enforcement crackdowns splintered the group into three distinct factions: the Gangster disciples, the Black disciples, and the Black Gangsters. Hoover, though incarcerated at the time on charges stemming from a gang-related murder, was still the driving force behind the Gangster disciples. From his prison cell, he orchestrated the gang's movements with the precision of a general on the battlefield. His influence was such that, even behind bars, he could command the loyalty of thousands of men, many of whom saw him as a leader who could challenge the system that oppressed them. It was here in prison that Hoover would begin to craft a new vision for the Gangster disciples, one that would transcend mere street-level crime and enter the realms of politics, economics, and social control. Building an empire from behind bars. Despite being incarcerated in 1973 for a murder conviction, Larry Hoover's influence continued to grow exponentially within the Gangster Disciples, GD organization. It's important to recognize that for many gang leaders, prison typically marks the end of their power. For Hoover, however, it was the opposite. From his prison cell, he managed to consolidate even more authority, controlling a criminal empire that extended beyond the streets of Chicago and into other states. Hoover demonstrated an uncanny ability to maintain his grip on the gang's operations while navigating the prison system. He managed to keep the Gangster disciples organized and in sync with his directives by employing an intricate communication network of loyalists who conveyed his orders from the inside to the outside world. Under his leadership, the GDs...
Pretty deep. That's some, but again, he's clearly a brilliant man. That's pretty deep. To control an empire, a gang empire with thousands of members from a jail cell, behind bars, because as they said, most of the time when you're a leader, a shot caller, once you go into prison, it's over, as far as the streets are concerned. Because it's hard to even communicate, and people don't respect you enough to listen to you when you're not even there. So that speaks to a lot of power to still be able to command thousands of people from prison.
Evolved into a highly structured entity, complete with rank systems, a code of conduct, and even financial operations. Hoover wasn't just running a gang, he was running an illicit corporation. The Gangster Disciples became one of the most powerful and influential criminal organizations in the United States, especially throughout the Midwest. Hoover's success came from his ability to merge the brute force of street crime with the organized efficiency of a legitimate business. He applied corporate strategies to gang operations, diversifying their criminal activities beyond just drug trafficking into extortion, fraud, and even money laundering. His reach expanded far beyond Chicago into states like Michigan, Indiana, and as far south as Mississippi. The political aspirations of Larry Hoover, the growth and development movement. What set Larry Hoover apart from many other gang leaders was his vision for social and political change. By the late 1980s, Hoover began to publicly distance himself from his criminal past, adopting a new role as a community leader. This transformation was part of his broader strategy known as the Growth and Development Movement, G&D, which sought to rebrand the Gangster Disciples as a legitimate political and social organization that could uplift the Black community. Through this movement, Hoover aimed to advocate for education, economic empowerment, and self-sufficiency for African Americans living in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. The message of G&D was one of redemption, not just for Hoover himself, but for his followers. He encouraged them to put down guns and take up more constructive activities like going to school, securing employment, and voting. The growth and development movement gained some traction, especially within communities that saw Larry Hoover as more than just a criminal. To his supporters, Hoover was a revolutionary, a man who had risen from the ashes of street violence to become a symbol of black empowerment. However, his critics, particularly law enforcement, viewed this transformation with skepticism, believing it was nothing more than a smokescreen for his continued criminal activity. Despite the controversy,
Either way, he has the foresight, the vision to build the community up. He's putting money into the community. Growth and Development was the name of his new corporation, his movement. So he had vision. He was a visionary. He had foresight. But of course, law enforcement is going to hold it against him and say that they're not buying it, that it's all a cover-up. Can they prove it?
surrounding G&D, Hoover's influence grew within prison as well as in political circles. His message of reform attracted politicians, activists, and even celebrities who advocated for his release. They argued that Hoover had reformed, that he was no longer the violent gang leader he had once been, but a voice for change in the black community. The continued crackdown. The government's response. The federal government, however, had a very different view of Larry Hoover's transformation. While Hoover portrayed himself as a community activist, law enforcement continued to investigate the gangster disciples under his command. To authorities, Hoover's rebranding was an elaborate front designed to obscure the gang's ongoing criminal operations, including drug trafficking and violence. By the mid-1990s, the U.S. government was determined to bring down Hoover and dismantle the gangster disciples. In 1995, a massive federal investigation led to Operation Headache, a sting operation that involved tapping Hoover's phone calls in prison and gathering evidence of his continued criminal activity. The operation revealed that despite his public claims of reform, Hoover was still directing the GDs, ordering hits, and controlling their drug empire. In 1997, Hoover was convicted on federal charges of conspiracy, extortion, and continuing criminal enterprise, among other crimes. His trial.
And that's what I was talking about when he got caught. You know, they wiretapped him. That was in 1995. He was trying to get out. As they said, he had all those celebrities and politicians and others lobbying for his release. Seemed like he was on the cusp of a release. And then the serpent-like government wiretapped him because they didn't believe that he had turned over a new leaf and they didn't want him to come home. Now, you can say that they ended up being validated because apparently they found a lot on these wiretaps, which led him back to court in a life sentence.
Was a high-profile event, and he was ultimately sentenced to 6 life terms in a federal supermax prison.
6 life terms, my bad. Jeez.
This marked a turning point in his story as he became a symbol of the U.S. government's war on gangs. For many, it was the end of an era. Hoover's downfall signaled a significant blow to the gangster disciples. Legacy and ongoing influence. The complex impact of Larry Hoover. Even after his conviction and subsequent transfer to a federal supermax prison, Larry Hoover's legacy continued to cast a long shadow over Chicago and the broader gang culture in America. To this day, Hoover remains a polarizing figure. For some, he is a hardened criminal who used his influence to poison communities with drugs and violence. For others, he represents the systemic failures that led to the rise of gangs in disenfranchised neighborhoods. Reflections on leadership and influence. Larry Hoover is often regarded as more than just a gang leader. He became a figure whose influence transcended street life. Through his leadership of the Gangster Disciples, GD, Hoover crafted a complex and multifaceted legacy that mixed messages of unity, community empowerment, and at times ruthless crime. Hoover's reign demonstrated that leadership is not always defined by morality, but by influence. He had the unique ability to bring people together, to inspire loyalty, and to shape the culture of an entire generation in Chicago's urban landscape. While much of this leadership was rooted in violence and the drug trade, Hoover was able to create a movement that many young men believed in. However, leadership is a double-edged sword, and Larry Hoover's eventual downfall was the result of his power being misused. As we reflect on the nature of his leadership, it becomes clear that Hoover had the potential to be a force for good, but the allure of money and power pulled him deeper into illegal activities, tarnishing any hope for redemption during his early year.
And you don't know that. You don't know if he was going to change his life, redeem himself, and use his powers for good at some point. It seemed like he was headed in that direction.
The shift to growth and development. One of the most pivotal moments in Hoover's later life was his attempt to rebrand the Gangster disciples into growth and development. From prison, Hoover began advocating for nonviolence and community upliftment. He claimed that the GDs were no longer interested in crime, but in promoting economic and educational opportunities for disenfranchised youth.
There you go.
Hoover's rhetoric during this period struck a chord with many who wanted to see Chicago's violence decrease. His message gave hope to a community ravaged by gang warfare and drug addiction. However, many questioned the sincerity of Hoover's transformation. Was this shift genuine, or was it simply an attempt to reduce his sentence and gain favor with the legal system? Despite the skepticism, the growth and development movement had real potential. It sparked a conversation about how inner-city leaders could use their influence for positive change. In many ways, Hoover's idea was revolutionary. He wanted to channel the power of organized groups like the GDs into something productive, something that could uplift instead of destroy. But even with this new vision, the shadow of Hoover's past continued to loom large over him.
Okay, but it seems like you're not giving him any credit for this vision that he had. At least he had the vision to uplift the community, to grow the community. He was supporting the community. What is your problem?
Legal battle and the controversy. Larry Hoover's legal battle is one of the most contentious aspects of his story. In 1997, Hoover was sentenced to 6 life terms after being convicted of running a drug empire from prison. The federal government's case against him painted Hoover as a ruthless kingpin who controlled every aspect of the drug trade in Chicago, even while incarcerated. The trial and conviction were surrounded by controversy. Some argued that Hoover was unfairly targeted by the government because of his influence and potential to mobilize Chicago's youth. They saw the government's actions as a means to suppress a leader who could bring about social change. Others believed Hoover's past actions spoke for themselves. His involvement in organized crime was undeniable, and his life sentence was simply justice being served. Regardless of where one stands, Larry Hoover's legal battle remains a testament to how the criminal justice system deals with influential figures who blur the lines between community leaders and criminals. His conviction also sparked debates on mass incarceration, systemic racism, and the role of African American leaders in inner-city communities. Was Hoover's imprisonment an example of the government being too harsh on black leaders? Or was it simply a necessary measure to stop a dangerous figure? Legacy behind.
I say it's the former. It's the government trying to suppress another black leader. As they said, they knew that he had the power and influence to rally the youth, to organize, inform, and unite the youth. This is the fear.
Bars. For over 2 decades, Larry Hoover has been confined to the high-security Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX, in Florence, Colorado, a place known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Despite this, Hoover's influence continues to be felt far beyond the prison walls. From behind bars, Hoover's name has become almost legendary, particularly among those who view him as a symbol of resistance against systemic oppression. In Chicago, his legacy continues to influence gang culture, although the original principles of the Gangster disciples have largely dissolved into more fragmented and violent groups. Hoover's story is not just one of crime and punishment, but also one of survival, power, and the complicated intersections between race, poverty, and the American justice system. As the leader of one of the most formidable street gangs in the United States, Hoover's influence on Chicago and its gang culture cannot be overstated. His actions shaped entire neighborhoods, and his rise to power along with the GDs serves as a case study in how crime can fill the void left by systemic neglect. While Hoover remains imprisoned, his influence on the streets has waned. However, the legacy of the gangster disciples persists. The gang, though fragmented and weakened, continues to be a force in the Chicago underworld. Meanwhile, Hoover himself has become a symbol for both those who seek reform in the criminal justice system and those who argue for harsher penalties for gang leaders. The man behind
Oh, don't underestimate him. He still has plenty of power, saying that his power has waned. His influence has waned in the streets, I'm sure, after decades upon decades in prison. But let him go then, because you said that you did not let him go because of the power and influence that he had, that he was still running this empire from behind bars. Now you are admitting, or at least the narrator here believes, that he doesn't have this sort of influence anymore, and it's not running any empire whatsoever. With that being the case, let him out now. He's in his 70s.
the myth. Larry Hoover's life is the story of a man who rose to the heights of power within an illicit world, commanding respect, loyalty, and fear. His rise reflects the complicated realities faced by countless young men growing up in poverty-stricken neighborhoods where opportunities are scarce and violence is omnipresent. In Hoover's story, we see the duality of the gangster as both a product of his environment and a creator of chaos within it. Though imprisoned for life, Hoover's name still resonates, a reminder of the pervasive influence of gang culture in America and the complex factors that drive it. As a figure of immense contradiction, Hoover embodies both the allure of criminal power and the tragic consequences that come with it. His life leaves behind questions that America is still grappling with. What drives young men to crime? How do we address the root causes of gang violence? And ultimately, can figures like Hoover be redeemed, or are they destined to live out their lives as symbols of a failed system? If you found this deep dive into the life of Larry Hoover insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on the figures and movements that have shaped history.
There you have it, man. Larry Hoover is crazy. You know, apparently they're not going to let him go ever. That's what it appears. They're never going to let him home. As I said, he seemed to be on the precipice of a release back in 1995. He had Jesse Jackson and others supporting him and going to Congress and other parts of the government trying to secure his release. That's when the government set him up, wiretapped him, and as they said, it's because, you know, he had all of this influence and they saw that he was about to come home, perhaps. He had a lot of people supporting him, for sure. And so they wanted to sully up his name and make sure that he did not come home because of the influence that he had over the youth. He could perhaps start a movement against the powers that be. And whenever you have a black man with that sort of power, they're going to get rid of you one way or another. Stay safe and stay free, people.